Okay, I think when the sound is working, I think we can start. Um, Good day or good morning, good afternoon to you in India. My name is Simona Klimkova, and I'm the head of the Department of English and American Studies here at Constantine the Philosopher University in Nitra. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all of our guests, both from Slovakia and India, to another lecture in the expert lecture series, which is organized under the Memorandum of Understanding signed between our university and the Saurashtra University in Rajkot, India. So today we are going to listen to the lecture of Dr. Kamal Mehta from the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies, who is going to talk about the great Indian writer Raja Rao and the presentation of India in his novels. So I'm very eager to listen to the lecture, as I'm only familiar with his only novel that I got, which is Kantapura. So I'm eager to listen to all the other interesting information. So without further ado, Dr. Mehta, I'm passing the word to you, and you can start your presentation. So hopefully the sound is working.
Thank you very much. In fact, I don't have any presentation to make. I'll
Mhm.
be directly speaking orally to all of you.
Okay.
Fine? Yeah. And later on, in a sense, Maria ma'am has suggested that I should give some handout or PPT. So I will pass on the PPT to you in a day or so. Any
Okay.
doubts? No problem. There is yeah. First of all, I greet all of you on this very important day. I greet all the students and faculty in India, as well as all the students and faculty in Slovakia. I'm very glad that these two very important departments of these two countries have come together for an academic tie-up and initiated some very, very significant activities which would certainly help our students to grow academically in their fields. And as a part of that particular event, today I'm going to speak on one of the very important Indian authors of, you can say, who began his career in the early part of the 20th century and continued almost for the entire century because he died in 2006, very a few years ago, a decade or so ago, and lived for almost 96 to 97 years. Let me begin in this way that novel per se is novel per se is basically the result of India's literary interaction with Europe and particularly England due to the colonial rule in India. The first novel which came out from India was in 1858 and it was in Bengali. While the first novel in English, entitled Rajmohan's Wife, came out in 1864 by none other than Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, one of the heralders of Indian Renaissance. Srinivas Iyengar, a very renowned historiographer of literature, notes that Indian novelists writing in English had many challenges and difficulties. They were facing several questions in front of them, like what to write, whether to write about escapism or romance expressing nostalgia, historical content, realistic social problems of India, etc. What should they write? Second question in front of them was for which purpose to write, whether for entertainment, edification, or something else. Third question in front of them was for whom to write, whether they were writing for the masses of India who did not know English or who had no access to English education, they were the majority, or the educated classes, who were a very small minority at that time, less than 1%. Fourth question in front of them was which variety of English should he use as his medium? Whether the writer should use chaste British English or which was making safe. In short, there were four types of challenges in front of every Indian author in English. It was regarding subject, medium, technique, and audience. Due to Renaissance, India underwent a powerful cultural encounter with the West for a long time. Ah, अच्छा, okay. સ્ટેન્ડ રહેવું નથી ને કરતા કહેવાનું ડિસ્ટર્બ થશે. આ છે ને રહેશે નહીં ના કરતા પકડી રાખીશ. You are doing it from there? Achha. Anyway, sorry, there was some technical issue. They were trying to arrange good recording. Due to Renaissance, India underwent a powerful cultural encounter with the West for a very long time, and its powerful representation is found in Indian novels as well. Thus, Indian historical realities, political conflicts, social realism, civil protests of different types, and a variety of other issues have attracted a large number of novelists to write about. Three great novelists who have their powerful presence in the memories and history books of Indian literature are Mulkaraj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao. They gave identity to Indian English literature, which has become very strong today, as the Indian English writers are very popular all over the world today, and now their works are getting translated into other world languages. Coming to the second point, Raja Rao, who was born in 1908 and who died in the year 2006, happens to be a unique writer among Indian English novelists. He has been unlike almost all due to his innovativeness, new themes, new idiom, and new techniques. He has been able to capture the spirit of India in his works and has perhaps communicated the truly Indian experiences to the world through his novels. Raja Rao comes from the southern India. He was the son of a mathematician. He was a scholar of Indian philosophy. He studied in prestigious Madrasa Aliyah of Hyderabad, where he was the only Hindu boy as a student then, and then the Nizam College of Hyderabad, and later Aligarh Muslim University. He studied history and English literature. He had been exposed to Sanskrit and Kannada languages at home and Persian, Arabic, and English at the school and college. Kannada is a local language of India. He had started writing in English at the age of 16 or 17 itself. Later on, he went to France for higher studies and got introduced to French language too. And he has written in French language as well. His research work was on the Indian influences on Irish literature. Rao was initiated into Sanskrit and philosophy by his grandfather, who did not know English himself. He voluntarily chose to write in English and make it Indian by integrating the Sanskrit traditions with the English ones. He made experiments with the language and its structure successfully. He states that when he published his stories in Europe, the writers like Romain Rolland and Stefan Zweig wrote letters of appreciation to him. Even the writer and critic E.M. Forster admired very boldly his style and structure of his writings. Rao married 3 times. His first wife, Camille Mauly, a French lady, was a professor of French. The second wife was an American actress, Catherine Jones, and the third wife was his own student at Texas, Susan Vought. He thought while in the USA that the great American minds like Thoreau, Whitman, and Emerson were greatly impressed by India and its teachings to humanity. However, the average American had no time and scope to study India. The writings from the 1960s and 70s, rather 60s and 70s onwards, were turning indifferent to philosophy and spiritual values. He felt that it was turning more and more psychological in representing the individual and the social issues of men. He felt then that the West was in the state of gestation and it had not reached its destiny. So he picked up philosophical and spiritual issues in his works. His novels are unconventional, but still Kanthapura, which he wrote in 1938, and Comrade Kirillov, which he wrote in 1956. So actually it was finished in 1950 itself, but it was published in 1956, can be called conventional novels because they represent India in a very conventional fashion. They depict socio-political realities of India. His other three novels, The Serpent and the Rope, 1960, The Cat and Shakespeare, 1965, and The Chess Master and His Moose, 1988, are highly unconventional and therefore very big challenges even for readers to interpret. He has, in addition, written a few anthologies of short stories as well as essays, though I would not be touching them in my lecture today. Rajarao has been awarded number of prestigious honors like Sahitya Akademi Award of the Government of India in 1964, Padma Bhushan in 1969, and the 10th NIST International Prize for Literature in 1988. Rajarao taught philosophy at the University of Texas for a very long time and took retirement from there in 1980. Some of his non-fictional works which require to be noted here are Changing India, which he wrote in 1939, The Meaning of India in 1996, and The Great Indian Way, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi in 1998. The things which make him very prominent as a writer is his great scholarship on primary Hindu, Buddhist, that is also, of course, Hindu only, and Christian philosophies. He has very good command over all these philosophies. He is profoundly metaphysical in his writings, and that is his uniqueness. Otherwise, novels were by and large social in nature, representing authentically the socio-political and cultural realities. They also traditionally revolved around the issues of matrimony and all other social issues to bring matrimony into picture. This is what we find in traditional novels. R. Parthasarathy, again a very important writer and critic, has described Rajarao as one of the most innovative novelists, as he deviated boldly from European traditions of the novel. He explored the metaphysical basis of writing itself and called his career of writing as his sadhana. Sadhana is a Sanskrit word which means spiritual pursuit. His writing is his spiritual pursuit. Rather than focusing on any specific nation or race or even ethnic group of people, he has focused on human condition of man. India is a very ancient nation having a history of millennia. When the world, excepting the Greece, was still struggling for satisfying its primary needs of life, India had six big universities teaching them medicine, literature and linguistics, pure sciences like mathematics, space, physics, etc., applied sciences like various disciplines of engineering, social sciences like political science, economics, history, psychology, philosophy, etc., among many other subjects. The first record of systematic studies in the form of books on language like grammar, phonology, vocabulary, semantics, etc., are found tracing back to 4th to 6th century BC. Studies on public administration, taxation, warfare, trade, etc., are also found tracing equally back in the same centuries. In this way, India has been the mother of philosophy, which goes to its higher stage of metaphysics. Elsewhere, philosophy remains philosophy, but in India, it rises up to the level of metaphysics and then again goes further and attains the state of spirituality. A deep thinking on who is man, society, universe, the creator of the universe, and what is the mechanism to lead the humanity to its best manifestations and development, they are very overtly discussed in any Indian philosophy that you take, right from Vedas to Buddha. The Indian concept of development is not merely material development, but a comprehensive development of individuals and society both. It is an overall prosperity. Rajarao feels that metaphysical and high philosophical thinking remain the special contribution of India for the betterment of humanity. All Indian spiritual philosophies try to understand the nature of three fundamental phenomena. One, man. Two, the universe. Three, the creator. Whether somebody believes in God or doesn't believe in God, may use any other term, the element, whatever. But these are the three things. In our language, we call them Jeev, Jagat, Jagadish. All Indian philosophies move on these three issues and relationship among the three. The development of the world depends on how our right understanding of the nature of man and his relationship with the universe is understood by us. Accordingly, the systems need to be developed in the society, whether it is social system, cultural systems, political system, whatever. It has to take into account all the three: man, universe, and the God. If any system ignores the basic realities of their nature, it will not succeed. Indian philosophies take note of, for example, four fundamental driving forces of man. There are four things which make men active in the world. They are dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Dharma is his duties. It is not only religion. Artha is economy, money. Kama is various desires, material desires, bodily desires, whatever, and moksha means salvation. So salvation is not exactly moksha, but for the sake of understanding, we can call salvation. These four things make human beings go ahead in life, do something, even sacrifice something to attain them. Which are they? I repeat: dharma, artha, kam, moksha. Either one works for dharma, or for artha, that is earning money, whatever, for kam to satisfy his needs, and fourth to attain some higher goal of life. Most of the systems in the world take note of only one or two of the four, and therefore whatever systems emerged out of their philosophies have collapsed. And very good example is Marxism and even capitalism. Because Marxism and capitalism, both of them take note of man and only one aspect of man, that is artha, and at the most kam. They neither think of dharma nor do they think of moksha. And since their entire system rests on only two, that system is not going to work. A chair must have four legs. If you build a chair having only two legs, you won't be able to sit on this. So capitalism and Marxism both developed their systems, social system, political systems. But since they had a very partial view of man and the universe and the relationship between the two, in fact, they collapsed in a very small period, less than a century. The West thinks of only individuals and society. And therefore, there is always a conflict between the two. When we think of dharma and moksha both, then perhaps we would be able to avoid conflicts in the society. Indian perspectives go beyond. It thinks of not only individual and society. In the West, either you think of individuals or you think of the society. Which one is superior, which one is inferior, what do, and so on and so forth. Indian perspectives, Indian philosophies take note of four things. Beginning is individual, that is called vyashti in Sanskrit, that is individual. Then comes society, which is called samashti. But it doesn't end here. The West ends here. India goes to third and fourth steps. Third step is universe, Srushti. It is not only society, societies of human beings, but in this universe, non-humans also exist. Environment also exists. Natural elements also exist. And who will take care? Human beings will take care. And therefore, we have to think of our relationship with that also. Now the West is coming back to that, and therefore ecological criticism, which is Srushti. And fourth is Parameshti, that is God. There is a creator, because such a big universe cannot come into existence on its own. We fail to understand because our reason, our intelligence has its own limitations. But there is a creator. There is some principle which is the cause of this big universe. So Indian philosophies speak of four things: individual, society, universe, and the maker of the universe. If one of these four is ignored, then our thinking is lopsided. Our philosophy is lopsided, and we won't be able to bring prosperity and development which we desire or which would be sustainable. Peace would not stay in the society. If we do not take up these four, then there will be lot of conflicts between man and society, man and universe, that is man and environment, man and other man, and also man and God. If we want to avoid these conflicts between man and society, man and universe, man and God, then we need to take note of all the four and devise certain systems in the society which would lead to sustainable development of humanity. If we want a conflict-free society, all the four must be given due place in our social, moral, administrative, educational, and even religious systems. If religion also does not take note of all the four, that religion will not survive. If education doesn't take note of all the four, it will not survive. Political system won't survive. We have to find an integral relationship among all the four and come forward. Raja Rao, in his metaphysically oriented novels, focuses on India, which exists in various metaphysical ideologies and philosophies. Even his conventional novels are also metaphysically charged with their themes. Thus, he presents in his novels the eternal and essential India that has been existing in the hearts and minds of average Indians for centuries. Let me now take you inside the fictional world of Raja Rao and acquaint you with his India in them. To begin with, his first novel, Kanthapura, written way back in 1938, depicts the colonial period and the great freedom struggle against the British under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Overtly, it represents the insurgent India of 1930s. It shows how Gandhi's impact was working on the masses even in distant villages against the colonial rule. It tells the story of one village called Kanthapura. Kanthapura is the name of a village, and its participation in the freedom struggle under the local leader called Murthappa, who is called Murthy. It portrays various activities undertaken during the freedom struggle in this village. It glorifies the spirit of the people of not giving in to the powerful and inhuman Bade Khan, who is the agent of the colonizers. The atrocities inflicted on the non-violent satyagrahis by Bade Khan is narrated movingly. Also, what happens to Murthy in the jail and what goes on in his mind there and then is also narrated well. This is a typically conventional aspect of the novel in which a hero is fighting against the wrong, the evil, and the injustice. It is a story of his heroic actions. No doubt, the freedom is not yet attained, and so he is not victorious yet. Here, Rajaram is taking into account the Vyashti, that is individuals like Murthy, Rangamma, Rangegowda, Jairamachar, and other freedom fighters. He also takes an account of their attitude to the society, that is Samashti. How do they take note of the society, the relationship? All of them have come together, forgetting all the differences of caste, creed, and gender. They are willing to adjust and cooperate with everyone else in the village. Cooperation is necessary. They are not personally against even those who were trying to sabotage the movement and even those who were the perpetrators of injustice. If they give up their sabotaging and atrocious ways, the villagers have no problem to accept and mingle with them also happily. Thirdly, they also take care of the universe, that is Srushti. They do not destroy the coffee estate and the environment there. They don't break and burn anything when there was a big strike and thus do not cause any damage to the environment. Fourthly, they are dedicated to the ethical, moral, and human values and duties towards others and the future. They know that they have not been successful, yet they accept the reality without regret because they had not done anything wrong. They had not displeased their deities, their gods. As a result, there is no frustration or depression or any harmful reaction from them, though the movement has not yielded the desired result. That is freedom. They continue to do their struggle with full faith on the Almighty and their leader and their future. They know that they are fighting with the evil forces and the victory of the truth is inevitable. Only they cannot say when. The life goes on, of course, with a setback in their status and life quality. They have lost their land and will have to work in another village as laborers. Importantly, still they are confident that they would emerge again. And one day they will come back to Kanthapura and they will own their land again. Such a nice integration and tuning among the four elements sustains Kanthapura even amidst the depressing scenario. The enemy is very powerful and the protesters are very weak, yet the struggle continues. Even amidst all the odds, people are neither wild, selfish, or self centric, or vulnerable, or fearful, and not even surrendering to the ruling system. The rulers and their agents do everything that violates the basic Indian principle of integration among the four aspects. They don't respect individuals, they don't respect society, they don't respect God, I mean ethical values, moral values, truth and justice. Hence, in spite of their hand retaining very powerful hold, they are under pressure and hence lose their equilibrium and hope also. They act desperately. Those who had everything under their control, in fact, are not able to control themselves. And those who had hardly anything with their in their hands, in fact, are still defiant and confident. And what happens in future is India becomes independent. Why? Because they had followed the integration among the four elements of this world. Indian spiritual thinking believes that an individual can attain moksha, that is salvation, It is the territory of the individuals and not the societies or group. Man's relationship with God is personal and individual. It can be attained through three paths. One of them is karma, that is actions. I'm talking of another philosophy apart from individual, society, universe, and God. Now I come to three major ways through which one can attain all this. One of them is through actions, one can attain moksha, the four purusha dharmartha kam moksha. The other two are gnan, that is knowledge, and knowledge is not negative in Indian perspective. In Christianity, knowledge may be negative, but here knowledge means wisdom also. So knowledge is to be desired. And then bhakti, that is devotion, dedication. Right type of actions, right type of knowledge, and right type of devotion. When Range Gowda gets irritated due to inhuman behavior of Bade Khan and he wants to take retaliation, Murthy dissuades him not to take retaliation because that is not fair. We have to follow good path and not the evil path. Karma theory expects the individuals to identify their right role and action and perform with dedication, irrespective of the consequences. One simply performs and acts. Success or failure is not in one's hands and therefore need not be carried away by the consequences. If one continues to do one's karma with commitment, ultimately the dream would come true. Aspirations will be fulfilled. Even if one doesn't know why one is doing something, if he does that thing with dedication, there is no problem and he would certainly attain the result. And in Indian mythologies, there are a number of devils who did lot of penance. Because they did penance, God was pleased on them. Because God also cannot overlook their work. If they do something as per the demands, then they must get results. So they are, given whatever boons they demanded. So what is important is karma. You have to do karma. You have to do your action as per the requirement. The action would always lead one to its natural consequences. Murthy and other simple villagers do their action with full dedication, and therefore, in spite of their failure, they have not lost their hope, and their commitment for the struggle continues further. Rajaram has followed typical Indian style of writing in Kanthapura, which is called a sort of Sthala Puran, that you narrate the story of a place. Puran is a story, longer story. It is a story of a sthala means place. Kanthapura is the name of a place. It is the story of not Murthy, not Rangegowda, not Rangamma. It is the story of the village called Kanthapura. In that way, it is Thalapuran. The novel becomes an articulation of an eternal and mythical pattern of struggle between the good and evil. Rajara brings in a lot of folk element in the narrative. It does not move in a linear fashion, and there are stories within stories. Religion also gets mingled with all other activities. Past also gets mingled with the present. A lot of things are conveyed indirectly through references to the Ramayana. For example, Sita is associated with India. The British are associated with Ravan because Ravan had kidnapped Sita. So here Britishers have kidnapped Sita. That is India, kept India under their control, illegally, immorally. And Gandhi is associated with Ram, who will go to England and bring the freedom back to India. That is, bring Sita back to India. So in this way, by associating a certain story with mythological stories, he is able to convey the eternal truths of life. And that makes his discourse easily understood in India. The encounter between the East and the West is direct and it is in material terms in Kanthapura. Thus, the novel emphasizes a lot on doings of the characters because it is about karma theory. The novel conveys to those who do not know this theory to understand its fundamental nature. Raja Rao's another novel, Comrade Kirillov. I will take it here itself, though in sequence it comes later. Comrade Kirillov was published in 1978 and it was written in 1950. And since it was finished in 1950 itself, I think I can take up it here itself in our discussion. It deals with the political realities of India. The focus being on not exactly the real fight between the Indians and the British, but here the fight is of a different nature because he is moving towards metaphysics. The focus is on the struggle in the mind of an Indian called Padmanabh Iyer, who is the protagonist of the novel. And Padmanabh Iyer is a Marxist, a staunch Marxist, an active Marxist. And he has gone to Russia also. He has been highly impressed by the Bolshevik Revolution. And he is a great scholar of Marxist thoughts. And therefore, he has found an important place in Russian Politburo. He gets so much impressed with Marxism that he changes his name from Padmanabh to Kirillov. This is his conversion to Marxism. Marxism is also another religion, the way we have other organized religions in the world who indulge in conversion. So he gets converted into a Marxist, Kirillov. But can he become a total Marxist? Can he cease to be an Indian? This is the problem. He cannot. He cannot embrace Marxism completely, and he cannot give up his Indianism also completely. Because of which, a split personality comes into existence. And there is a big conflict within his mind. He doesn't know. He is ambivalent about where to go. And therefore, this conflict is the main concern of this novel. He is a split personality. He represents the leftist ideology-oriented intellectual of India, who has taken up Marxism also as a religion, which is a sort of monotheism, and expect the followers to renounce their erstwhile religions completely. It doesn't let the follower see its own weaknesses and reform them. What I say is, when somebody is blindly a follower of a religion and indulge in converting others, then such persons cannot see the weaknesses on their part. They cannot see the plus points on the part of the person whom they are converting. And therefore, they become blind in double ways. That exactly happens in case of Kirillov. He cannot see any weaknesses of Marxism, and he cannot look at the good points of India. The result is he is condemned to lead a very painful life, which is the result of his own intellectual ambivalence. Indian thinking never expects anyone to renounce what others already possess. Indian thinking decides to embrace everybody else with whatever they have. Not that you give up what you have and come to us. You retain what you have and then come to us. It is a sort of pluralism. Also allows the person to be aware of his own weaknesses and therefore reform them. So India has produced large number of reformers who have brought in, and all the reformers also come from religion. It expects one to adopt the good things even if they are from the opponent. These two perspectives can't exist simultaneously together. So Kirillov is not able to give up his real self and adopt the new self completely. And hence, there is a dualism in him. The ideologies with thinking are tolerant and ready to change and alter themselves also, whereas whichever ideology has emerged out of monotheistic thinking always feels that it is always right, and hence all others who are not like it are wrong. Therefore, one needs to eradicate the other, and therefore the idea of other becomes very strong, and he is identified as the enemy. And therefore, we have seen in the world the concepts like jihad and crusade. In India, there is no concept of either jihad or crusade. Wherever the society at large permits them to impose their perspective on others, they act fanatically. Even Marxism, which critiqued religion, actually adopted all the weaknesses of a religion to promote their ideology, and thus Marxism itself became a new religion. Identification of the other comes first, and then there is a systematic effort to erase it by hook or crook. This is a negative impact of the West on India, because there are so many good things also to learn from the West, but our people learned something which they should not have learned. India has always allowed coexistence of a variety of religions and practices very smoothly. Now, under this impact, people, particularly the educated ones, are turning intolerant of other ideologies, and particularly the leftists. And Rajarao is projecting them in this novel. Marxism has so much colonized the mind of Padmanabh that he changes his name from Padmanabh to Kirillov, I said earlier. This is a kind of conversion, psychological conversion, ideological conversion. The protagonist is having great love and pride for India and its heritage on the one hand, but he should not manifest it because he's a Marxist. He has learned how to be hypocrite. It does not have courage to stand by what he believes in. On the one hand, he thinks that God is the fiction of the lazy. On the other hand, he wears Yagnopavit, that is the holy thread, which is a ritualistic thread. He also takes holy pilgrimage to Banaras, which is a holy city of India. The author very subtly mentions that the coat put on by him does not fit on his tiny shoulders. The ideology and his real self do not match. Kirillov states that a Marxist is always a realist. He writes a book, Mahatma Gandhi, a Marxist interpretation, in which he criticizes Gandhi as a Marwadi capitalist and finds him suitable for the Middle Ages only. He calls him kleptomaniac and unscientific. He also describes him as a stupefying fool, a sadhu reactionary, and a believer of caste system. But his own wife, Irene, describes in her diary Gandhi as the god of her husband. This is what he writes, but at home he has high respect for Gandhi. The author rightly says, how can one be sincere and honest and yet fundamentally dishonest? Thus, Rajarao has satirically portrayed his character. Padmanabh, in the end, hands over his son Kamal to the narrator R to take him to India for immersion of the bones of his mother and show him the grandeur of India. He hands over his son to his friend to take my son to India and let him get acquainted with India. Perhaps he doesn't want his son to remain a Marxist and a hater of Sanatan culture. Do I have time, ma'am?
Yes, we still
How
have
much time?
some time.
Because
Yes, we still have some
how
time.
much time I have? Okay, because
We have like 10 minutes, I think.
okay, very good. Then I'll be able to finish here. Because what is the crux of the Rajarao work has to come now. In fourth part of my lecture, I want to focus on his unconventional metaphysical philosophical novels. The other three novels of Rajarao are highly unconventional in their portrayal of India, and they should be read unlike our reading of the conventional novels. If we read these novels the way we read other novels, then then we will do injustice to Rajarao and perhaps will fail to understand him and interpret him correctly. For example, some critics they have stated that the author is critical of the conventional marriages, and hence Rajarao himself married 3 times, and all his protagonists also have more than one marriages or more than one affairs. They have extramarital affairs. Shivaram, for example, doesn't marry at all, but has relationship with 3 Western women and 1 Indian, and he doesn't marry anyone. His protagonist Ram in The Serpent and the Rope or Ramkrishna Pai, all of them in fact have wives also, and they have other than wives also. And what we see is that they are more leaning towards those who are not their wives. They are leaning more towards their beloved. And therefore, it seems as if Rajarao is renouncing the Indian social system of marriage. This is not true. This is not true because it is not that the protagonists of Rajarao are not comfortable with the system, with the institution of marriage. In these metaphysical novels, the characters are not individuals. Ram is not an individual, the way we find individuals in complex novels. Ramkrishna Pai is not an individual. Shivaram is not an individual. All of them are ideas. All of them are flat characters. All of them are concepts. And Rajarao as a writer is trying to convey through not only the protagonist but also other characters certain ideas, certain philosophies, and therefore we need to look at them in their allegorical sense, in their symbolic sense. If we do that, then only we would be able to understand things better. His 3 novels, The Serpent and the Rope, The Cat and Shakespeare, and The Chess Master and His Moves, respectively deal with 3 major Indian philosophies or Indian perspectives. That is Gnanamarg, the path which emphasizes on knowledge, that is attaining moksha through knowledge, that is Serpent and the Rope. Then attaining moksha, salvation through dedication, devotion, Cat and Shakespeare. And attaining moksha, nirvana, in a typically Buddhist fashion, that is the Chess Master and His Moves. Because karma is already discussed in Kanthapura. Rajarao has very interestingly revealed these philosophies through the stories in these 3 novels. And large number of people follow these paths. If we include action marg also, action path also, then these are the 4 paths which are followed in India. We may take any religion which has come up of India. The sage Shankar happens to be the propounder of the non-dualist philosophy. According to that philosophy, the human soul and the creator of the universe are not 2 separate entities. They are one, but they appear to be 2 distinct entities. So serpent appears to be rope sometimes, and sometimes rope appears to be serpent. Why one appears to be the other and the other appears to be the one? It is because of ignorance. If we get rid of ignorance, then we understand serpent as serpent and rope as rope. And therefore, this novel is entitled as The Serpent and the Rope. Ramaswamy, a very bright young man, having a wonderful, powerful background of scholarship, family background scholarship, goes to France for higher study and research in history. There, he falls in love with his own professor of history, Madeline, who is very senior in age also, but both of them marry. After the marriage, somehow these 2 are not able to go along very well. But the family of Madeline finds Ramaswamy to be very suitable. They love Ramaswamy more than they love Madeline, though these 2 do not go together very well. And the reason for not going together very well was that Ramaswamy's mother dies in India and therefore he has to go. And that was the period when Madeline was going to give birth to their first child. And she naturally wanted a typical human expectation that her husband is with her at that time. But Ram could not be. And then he returns. And when he returns, then Ram, under the again magic of India, is slightly different than when he had gone to India. So Madeline thinks that Ram is not finding more interest in her. He is perhaps ignoring her, or he is not able to come to the level of her expectation, as if he doesn't love her. Because Madeline thinks that love can be shown in a certain fashion only. And Ram is not able to show his love for Madeline in that fashion, which is a typically materialistic fashion. Where you have to say a few things, do a few things, bring a few things. This Ram is somehow not doing. And therefore, she jumps to this conclusion that Ram is no more in love with her. Now, if he is not loving her, there is no point in taking marriage further. And therefore, Madeline demands divorce. Ram doesn't want a divorce. Ram is certainly disturbed because he is not able to understand how to handle the situation, because divorces at that time were unimaginable in India. And therefore, nobody thought of divorce. Even if they quarreled every day, but they will not divorce each other. But here is a new situation, new reality. He is in a disturbed mood. At that time, something else happens. What happens is one of his friends, who is an IPS officer in India, gets betrothed, engaged to an Indian princess called Savitri. And Savitri is a student in London. And Savitri is a typically, you can say, ultra modern girl, absolutely un-Indian if you look at her in that particular time. Given to smoking, given to drinking, going to clubs, dancing with others, having so many boyfriends. And one of them happened to be a Pakistani boy. And therefore, her would be husband is slightly worried. He thinks that if Savitri meets Ram and Ram interacts with her, then Ram is capable of counseling her very well and bring her back to normal life, make her a good girl again, or good lady again. And therefore, he suggests to Ram that Savitri is going to London and France is on the way. Therefore, she should be with Ram for a couple of days. And during those couple of days, he should interact with her, counsel her in such a way that Savitri is a changed lady. And that exactly happens. Savitri and her brother, both of them, stay with Ram in Medellin for a couple of days. And there their interaction, they talk about philosophy, they talk about scriptures, about Indian epics, and so on and so forth. And Savitri is so much influenced by Ram that she changes out and out. She becomes a totally transformed person. But she also brings one more problem. The problem is she falls in love with Ram. Now, this is difficult because on the one hand, she is going to marry the friend of Ram, and now the would-be wife of the friend falls in love with himself. He is himself married. What to do? He tries to manage everything, send her back to London also, and once goes to London to see her how she is faring, and she is doing everything so well. Savitri has understood his teachings very well, and she promises Ram that she would become an ideal wife to Pratap. She would marry Pratap, and she would never give a single opportunity to Pratap for complaint against her. But she will always think that her husband is not Pratap but Ram. And therefore, Ram should marry her even symbolically, without any expectations of marriage. And Ram agrees, Both of them have a symbolic marriage all alone in the room of Savitri, and immediately after marriage, Ram goes to railway station to see off Savitri for India because she goes to France in train and from there she takes a boat to India. And in India, Savitri proves to be an ideal wife. There is no problem from anyone. But Ram is disturbed. Now Ram finds it very difficult. On the one hand, Madeline wants divorce, and therefore he is disturbed. On the other end, there is another lady who has such a great dedication and love for him, and she doesn't expect anything. It's a kind of platonic, metaphysical love, whatever. So he starts thinking, which one is real? Which, what is marriage? Means an entanglement, attachment. He is not against the system, against the institution of marriage, but he is certainly in favor of the true spirit of marriage, whether it is institutional or it is not institutional. If it is institutional and it doesn't respect the spirit, then it is illusion. If elsewhere it is not institutional, but it is genuine, it gives joy, it gives bliss, joy not in a very material sense. If it gives bliss, even that is also marriage. It may not be marriage in the worldly sense of the term, but it is certainly marriage in the metaphysical sense of the term. So Ram is tossing what to do and is in lot of dilemma. And there comes a moment when he meets Savitri for the last time. Then Savitri now convinces him that he should go back to Madeline only. Madeline is his wife. He should prove to be an ideal husband. And then one whom he had taught now teaches him. He becomes a changed individual. He comes back to the world of Madeline. Divorce has already taken place, but he is able to stay with the family of Madeline in France itself. And he has no complaint, no problem with Madeline. And Madeline also comes one step forward and she becomes a Buddhist. And she starts following the Buddhist teaching of spirituality. So, what makes serpent serpent, and what makes us see rope rope, or what makes us see rope in serpent? This is beautifully, metaphorically, and metaphysically revealed in the serpent and the rope. The cat and the chess master in his moves appears to be almost recasting of the same story. The difference being that here Shivaram, the protagonist, is married to none. At the same time, here there is lot of discussion discourses. There is a kind of discussion between the Rabbi and Brahmin, that is Shivaram, the Jew religious thinker and irreligious thinker. And there is a lot of debate between the ideologies, the religions as they are understood in the West and religion as it is understood in India. So that if in case I have time, I'll come to. Otherwise, I would finish this novel Cat and Shakespeare and then we can have interaction also. The Cat and Shakespeare is perhaps, in my career as a teacher in last 35 years, I have not found any other novel more challenging than the Cat and Shakespeare. Most challenging, most difficult to comprehend. And every clue which you arrive at, in fact, triggers to another problem. And some very, very experienced critics have described this particular novel as a true Indian novel. That if people have discussed what can be a true Indian novel, then such critics say that we should give an example of the Cat and Shakespeare, which is a true Indian novel, which exactly represents the India that exists in its spirit, the India as it communicates through its words and actions. If somebody wants to see what is India and understand it, then one should read Cat and Shakespeare. It is very complex on the one hand and very simple on the other hand. You need a key. If you have that key, it opens so easily. It is very easy to get united with India, provided you have that key with you. Otherwise, even if you are very close to India, you can never understand India. Max Muller, for example, till he was working in his project, he did all other things. But when he was free from his project, then he wrote a book, What West Should Learn from India. Totally, totally opposite of what he was supposed to do. And that he taught to the British civil servants that when they go to India, then they are not going there simply to enjoy the luxury of the job, but they should also bring some learning from India. And therefore, in the training of these civil servants, ICS officers, in fact, he rendered his services for many years. He offered a course on India there. My point is, Kate and Shakespeare is challenging in this sense. Even if you look at the title, what has Shakespeare to do with India? And what has Shakespeare to do with cat? But here you have cat. The cat comes from the Indian philosophy. Because in one of the philosophies, it is cat. Cat is goddess. And kitten is individual. There is a called Marjaranyaya. We have seen a cat carrying its kitten from one place to another, holding the kitten in her mouth. Until the kitten is in the mouth of the mother cat, that kitten is the safest, you can say, entity in this world. Even if there are hundreds of dogs and the kitten is within the mouth of the mother, no dog can cause any injury to the kitten. The mother would always save. This philosophy believes this is bhakti. Who is a devotee? Who is a disciple? If I worship A or B or C, then I should have so much faith, as much faith a kitten has on his mother. Because my God is like my mother. And I should not question my God. I should allow my God, my mother, to do whatever she does. Because I should be sure that my mother would never cause any harm to me. She will always take me to a safer place, to a better place. How long the mother takes care? Till kitten open their eyes. The moment kitten are able to take care of themselves, the mother leaves them. Now you are free, now you live your life in your own way. Therefore, here there is a cat. This cat is God. You have to follow the goddess. In order to follow the goddess, you also need some supervisor, some guide who has already walked on this path, who can guide your journey, your spiritual journey. And for that, you need a supervisor, a wise man. And therefore, he has chosen Shakespeare. Shakespeare is wise. He is very wise in worldly matters. He knows how to handle crisis in life. He understands the intricacies of the problems. And so here you have Shakespeare. But this Shakespeare is really not Shakespeare. This Shakespeare is a character called Govindan. And Govind is the name of Krishna. Krishna is also known as Govind. So here you have Govindan. This Govindan is the true supervisor and guide of Ram Krishna Pai, the individual who wants to walk on the path of spirituality. Govindan Nair is very simple, sometimes very funny also. Because if we assess him with contemporary parameters or you can social parameters, then he may appear very weird, but he is not weird. Whatever he is doing in a very organized manner. For example, whenever he comes to Ramakrishna's home, he doesn't come via door, via gate. What he does is he jumps over the wall and comes. Now, a matured individual would not go to somebody else's place by jumping over the compound wall. There is a gate, one has to come via that gate, but he doesn't. But this wall is symbolic. The wall is the wall that divides. Govindan overcomes every barricade. He doesn't respect any barricade. We have to do away with all the barricades. Govindan, when his young son dies, even in such a situation, is able to remain very composed. Though he is very simple, but he's very, very matured. He works in a ration shop because India was undergoing rationing in 60s and 70s because of scarcity of grain and other things. So this man is working in ration shop, and therefore a lot of black marketing was taking place, and real, you can say, beneficiaries were not getting grain. The office in which Govindan was working, in fact, lot of corruption took place, and the charge came on Govindan Nair because he was looking after that particular section. So Govindan Nair is arrested and he goes to jail. And he has to prove his innocence, that he is not involved in corruption. He knew who had done corruption. His boss had done corruption, but there was no proof. And Govindan is a worshipper of the mother, that is goddess, the cat. Now see how something happens in the novel. Rajarao does it. And this is typical Indian way of narrating the story. In the court, the case is going on, the judge is sitting, the culprit is there in the box, the advocates are pleading against and in favor, and a large number of files are brought from the office and they're kept on the table of the judge. From somewhere, a cat comes. The judge is demanding proof that Mr. Govindan, you give me proof, evidence that you are innocent. At that time, a cat comes from the window, jumps on the files. All the files fall down, and one file falls in the lap of the judge, and it is open. And what the judge finds there is a letter having the signature of his boss about some secret dealing with some agencies. And in this way, a proof is found that real culprit was not Govindan, but Mr. Iyer and not Mr. Nair. And so the entire case, in a very magic realism manner, you cannot say that cat cannot do this. One cannot say the file cannot fall, but in a magic realism manner, the file falls and Govindan is relieved. He is set free by the court. This is the result of his worshipping of cat, God. Not here the cat as biologically the cat, but the mother. So Ramakrishna Pai is also now convinced that he must follow the ways of Mother Cat. And so he takes initiation, formal guidance from Govindan Nair, and Govindan Nair asks him to follow Mother Cat. And again, surprisingly, what happens is that one day Pai happens to see a cat. So he decides to literally follow the cat, Mother Cat, the goddess. The cat goes on a wall. He also starts walking on the wall. There is a huge wall. When he is walking on the wall, he has a vision. And that vision is the vision of paradise. On the other side of the wall, there is paradise, where all the animals stay together. Nobody is harassing any other. It is beautiful, beautiful flowers, lush green. And the way we have the picture of paradise in Bible or in Christianity, ideal, where nobody is the enemy of anybody else. In fact, that paradise, that particular garden with G capital, in fact, is visualized by Ramakrishna Pai. And that is perhaps Rajarao's intermingling of the East and the West. Because here you have Shakespeare, so Shakespeare will show you paradise. So here, Guru has shown in paradise, that is ideal human society, where nobody is anybody's enemy. And that happens when you follow the path of devotion, total dedication. Ramakrishna Pai follows it, and as a result,
he also attains his moksha. He also finds fulfillment of all his desires. I'll take 1 minute only to go to chess master, then I'll finish. In chess master, in fact, the game of chess is being presented as a typical metaphor of life. And chess as a game has originated from India. Any game which has originated from India has Indian philosophy in it, whether it is kabaddi, whether it is hockey, whether it is athletics, whatever, and even chess. So there you have one or the other Indian philosophies. Here the Indian philosophy is that in the chess, you have board. Then the face of life keeps on changing every moment. The moment either you or the other make one movement, the picture of life changes. Whether you do something or somebody else does something, it affects entire life. Even if the pawn is moved, it affects the queen also, it affects the camel also, it affects the elephant also. You are so much related with everything else in this world. You are not independent. You are not an island. You are integrally related with everything else. And so every action of yours leads to certain consequences. And you are responsible for your own move. One who is able to understand truth he moves at a time, that if I do A, then what would be done by B, and then what will I do later on. More and more matured is one in understanding the life. Deeper and deeper one is capable of understanding the meaning of life. In fact, he would be able to play very well. There are so many other things, but time is the problem. So I just refer to this metaphor chess master in this. This is what I see that Raja Rao has uniquely. So unlike other novelists, whether from India or others, in fact, have portrayed in his works. Raja Rao is compared that if at all we want to find some equivalent from the Western world as novelists, then two names come forward. One is Proust, other is James Joyce. These two are the other great novelists from the West who can certainly come, at par with Raja Rao, or they are on the same platform. I thank all of you. Thank you very much. I know that the issues which I was dealing with were highly unfamiliar with the students there. I tried to simplify as much as possible, but I don't know. Your questions will let me know how much I have been able to put across. And I'm really sorry for taking more time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta, for your wonderful presentation. It was very insightful. And while Raja Rao might not be that familiar to our students or a known author to our students, I think you have done a great job to introducing his work in a very complex way and a very approachable way. So thank you for that. I will now open the round for questions and discussion. You can ask your questions directly, or you can use the chat for that. So I will wait a few seconds. If there's someone who wants to ask something, then please do. Or maybe I will start myself because I have actually a lot of questions. As I mentioned, I have read Kantapura several years ago, and I found the work very interesting. But it's the only novel that I have read by Raja Rao, so this was a very interesting introduction to his other novels as well. And I would like to go back to the beginning of your lecture, where you have actually talked about the challenges of Indian writers in particular that they have to face, or post-colonial writers in general. And I'm interested in the question or the problem of the target audience, because as you have demonstrated in your lecture, the novels of Raja Rao are very complex and also difficult to interpret. And I'm thinking about the challenges of the non-Indian reader to embrace the full complexity of his work. So what is your take on this, and how does Raja Rao, in your opinion, have this diverse audience in mind when he is writing his novels? Because there are many strategies or techniques that writers can use, right? To mediate the culture, etc. So does he have this diverse audience in mind, or does he write specifically for Indian audience?
No, I personally feel that he wrote not for Indians, but for the non-Indians. Because at one point of his writing, he says, and he refers to Americans because he was teaching philosophy there. These three writers, like Whitman and others, they had understood India to some extent, but others either they don't or they don't have interest. In order to communicate Indian philosophies, Indian worldview, perspective to them, in fact, he took recourse to novels of this kind, where through stories he is conveying the philosophies. But as you rightly said, that until and unless there is an interpreter, if there is no interpreter between the reader and the writer, then perhaps it may be just lost. For example, Vande Mataram, which is a very well-known slogan, a slogan for independence. It was lying in the book for so many years. When Sri Aurobindo critiqued that particular poem from the novel and explained it, then it became a slogan and it went to each and every village of India and it became a slogan for independence, Vande Mataram. So who was required? Somebody who could stand between Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and the people. Same thing is perhaps required between Rajarao and his readers. And there have been some very good critics who have already, you can say, critiqued the works of Rajarao, critiqued the philosophies as he has entangled in his works. So if we take recourse to those critical works, then Rajarao becomes easy to understand. But he certainly had the other non-Indian readers primarily in mind.
Yes, I was just alluding to a lot of the references to culture, for example, or philosophy that you have mentioned in your presentation as well.
Yeah.
For example, while reading Kantapura, without the foreword, actually, that was written by the author himself,
Yes.
where he mentions this reference to
Yes.
Sthala Puranas, I would have no idea
Yeah.
that the work is kind of written in
Yeah.
this kind of style. So
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
is maybe lost on the non-Indian reader. That's the challenge to.
Yes, yes.
It's a wonderful
Yes,
thing
yes.
to understand the complexity of the work in such a way. So
True, true.
yeah. Okay.
So
I will
Sthala
now.
Purana is, and as I, yeah, please.
Yes, go
The
on.
Sthala Purana is a story of a place. Yes, Sthala Purana is a story of a place. In every place, its own story and history. Unfortunately, we don't know. We should try to understand. And in India, every village has its own history. That is what people believe. And therefore, this is also one of the Sthal Puran. We associate certain place with Ram, certain place with Krishna, certain place with Bhim, Arjun, like they had stayed here, somebody had cooked here. So in this way, he narrates in that particular fashion. But you rightly say that for people who are not Indian, this is absolutely new, and therefore find it more challenging.
Yes.
Yes, please.
But it's also very rewarding when you find something like this out, and then you'll see what
Yeah.
kind of thought went into the process of writing. So, yes.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Can you see it, or I can read it? Does this kind of magic
Please.
realism really happen in real life?
In fact, whatever happens in life is always real. Many things we find to understand and explain to ourselves how it has happened. And therefore, we find it to be magic realism. Otherwise, there is nothing called magic realism. Many things are beyond our intelligence, and therefore we take it as a miracle. But actually, it is not a miracle. We are yet to understand and interpret how it has taken place. So they do take place. There are so many things in life, in everybody's life, which are beyond our understanding, and yet they are realities. They are certainly realities.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Then
Yeah.
please.
If you have time, then let me tell one anecdote. In 2001, there came an earthquake in Gujarat primarily, massive earthquake. And I had an opportunity to go to that place. And we happened to meet one lady in one camp. And that lady narrated a story which all of you should really listen to. She was pregnant at that time when earthquake came. They were staying on the fourth story of the building. There was no lift. And the building started shaking. So everybody was worried that how to take her downstairs. So if her husband, whatever, that let's go. But she said, if you try to take me with you, then you will also collapse. We do not know when this building would collapse. So best is that you people save yourselves. Let our children be saved. Leave me here to my fate. And so the entire family with heavy heart, in fact, rushed downwards. This lady went outside into the gallery and just started praying to God, and building collapsed. She had closed her eyes. When she opened her eyes, she was on the road. She just crossed the railing and walked on the road. Only she had survived. Nobody in the building had survived. It was a matter of a few seconds. Now, this is reality, but this is magic realism also at the same time. Since we know, we saw that this may happen, but those who do not know, they may take it as a miracle. It depends on how we look at it. So magic realism is often like this.
May I have a question?
Yes.
I
Please.
really like the story that you shared now,
Yeah.
and I really like the way how you presented Indian philosophy or Indian insight into life and the meaning of it. When you were talking about those four parts, like that in the Western world, we are either individual or society focused, but in India, it's more embracing that you also involve universe and the maker in all of that. I would like to know about your observations as far as young people of modern India are concerning this philosophy of life, because it seems to me to be a very holistic, very complex worldview. So there must have been also, and there still is, a very strong impact of the Western culture on India. So what about young people, your students, for example? Do they embrace this philosophy also, or are they more West-centered now? So that would be my question.
In fact, what I see is that the younger generations, and if some of them are really very bright, intelligent, then they are able to combine both what is best in the West and what is best in the East. And that is real wisdom. If we think that whatever we have is the only good thing, then that is foolishness. And whatever is outside is only good thing, that is equally foolishness. So very few people, in fact, take interest into philosophies and these kinds of, you can say, things. But there is a small class, small number of people who are taking interest, and they are taking very keen interest. And I always have faith that a committed minority, not minority in the sense of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Isai, but small number of people, a group, a committed minority can always change the world. The world is never changed by majority. The world is always changed by minority. The requirement is this minority has to be highly committed. So that small class of committed people are coming up. They're involved in so many philanthropic activities. They're involved in social reforms. They're involved in so many other things. So I see a kind of hope in such individuals. They would be hardly 1 or 2%, but their number is emerging, and they are proving themselves to be more impressive in the society. So they would do. And I think this would be the case in West also, where a small number of people are given to such ideals. So this philosophy would come up.
May I take the,
Please.
Madam
Please,
and
Jala
sir, may I take the liberty to just add to
please.
what Mehta sir said and what your insight is about our students or the in our times, how is the next generation? First and foremost thing I think is, sir rightly said that there is there are people who are committed. On the other hand, it is a spiritual nation as we not just regard, but as we see. And in that case, it's not the question of the so-called educated who are westernized, uh, who would always think of intellectualizing everything and falling to discourses. But it is a living spiritual nation, wherein if you go to villages, even today, you will find the same life of what is presented in Kantapura. Fine. And people, for example, uh, uh, can relate themselves to the universe by just feeding dogs, cows. These are little acts, but this is part of life, and that is why Hinduism is way of life. So anxiety might be there at our level, intellectual level, for a few, but it is a living civilization, and that's what Raja Rao is presenting, and that's idea of India that he presents, that this is India, not uh, and probably it's a dialogy that we see in Serpent and the Rope as well as Chess Master, and through this dialogy, the whole idea that what is India, so that is reflected, but actually you can see it, live it in India. Thank you.
Thank you a
Thank
lot,
you, sir,
both of
for
you,
super
for
good
your
talk.
answers.
Thank you, Jala Sahib. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you all. I think, unfortunately, we have to close as our students are taking other classes at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much for, again, for your wonderful presentation. It has given us a lot of food for thought, I think. So we are already preparing another or working on another lecture in the series. So hopefully we will all meet soon and continue with this interesting and stimulating discussion. So it's really enriching for us. So thank you once again, Dr. Mehta, and hopefully see you soon online. Thank you all.
And I will send you notes. I will send you notes of this lecture. I'll prepare and I will send in a day or so.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.